Cool. Hey, how's it going?
Doing good, doing good. How are you, sir?
Good. Thanks for having me to kick this off, and excited to be here. So I wanted to run through some of the work that my teams have been doing over the last semester or so. Culminating in KubeCon, but we really kind of try and have exciting features coming out all the time, right? Rather than being date-driven about a package of things to launch at a particular conference. We kind of have continuous innovation going on. I'm going to start out with the open service mesh, which you mentioned, which is there's going to be a much deeper dive on it later on with Phil, which is great. But over a little while ago, we launched the open service mesh, which is a service mesh implementation open source project out on GitHub. It's intended to be a simple to use service mesh. I think we have a lot of people who are out there who are thinking about how do I get started with service mesh. But they may only have relatively simple needs like end-to-end encryption or experiments, and it can be a pretty daunting thing to get started with. And so the open service mesh is really intended to be an easy-to-use service mesh that can grow and scale with you. We've recently released the 0.5 release of that, and really kind of beefed up things like the end-to-end testing suite, so that we're headed towards production stability, ensuring that that it works the way it's supposed to work, which is always a good thing. As part of that, we've gotten it actually out into the CNCF as the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, which is the sort of umbrella organization for a lot of these open source projects. And that, I think, is a really great thing because it enables us to have vendor neutral collaboration, right? So people can take dependencies, people can come and collaborate and contribute to it, with the knowledge that this isn't a Microsoft project, it's not an Azure project, but it's actually out in the community project. So that's a big step forward. And then also, one of the most important things about OSM is that it's an implementation of the service mesh interface spec, which was a general open spec that we actually created in collaboration with a number of other people more than a year ago. And the important bit of the service mesh interface is that there's a lot of different service meshes out there, and we don't want people to have to be tied to an API to a specific implementation because it may change over time. You may find bugs. You may just decide you need a different implementation in different environments. And so it's really important to have that sort of interoperability layer. And you see this in Kubernetes throughout, like in the storage layer or in the Open Container Initiative. There was a lot of talk a couple of days ago about how the Kubernetes project is removing Docker and focusing on containerd for the container interface. And I think people didn't initially realize that like all Docker containers are open containers, and there's this spec that is there so that you don't have to have the complete Docker toolchain in order to run these containers, because they implement a spec, right? So this generic spec that people can implement is an important part of interoperability. And so the service mesh interface plays that role for service meshes. We've been making a lot of progress on that spec, actually, and actually had community members from both Red Hat and AWS join in with us there recently. So that's because obviously these specs are only valuable if they're cross-industry, right? And so it's been great to see the progress there as well. And so, continuing to push both on the open implementation of the spec, but also on the independent spec, so that other people, HashiCorp or Linkerd or other people, can come along and implement the same spec, and people will have a choice of service meshes that they want to be able to use. That's pretty cool. So, as I said, Phil's going to talk about that later on.
Sure.
We've also done a bunch of work with with Azure Arc to think about how we do service mesh for both AKS and Azure Arc, and integrating service mesh into those solutions. One of the other things that we do a really great job of integrating into both Arc and AKS is policy. And I think policy is another great example of how we do open collaboration in the industry, but then also bring it back to our products. So there's a project that we actually kickstarted a long time ago called Gatekeeper, which is a policy engine in the open policy framework for Kubernetes. So if you want to be able to say things like, in a lot of compliant or regulated industries, you need to be able to establish policy that says, hey, look, in order to run an image in your cluster, it has to come from this one registry, because we know that we have the right kind of security on that registry. We know that we're doing, looking for vulnerable images. We know that the only place we can pull images from is there, and the only way to express that is through Kubernetes policy. Or similarly, and you might want to say, hey, only people who have gone through a security review can create a service that is out on the public internet, right? These are the kind of like compliance processes that companies need to be secure. The only way to ensure something like that in Kubernetes is through policy. And so, we went out, built up a cross-industry coalition in this CNCF project called Gatekeeper to develop policy. Because again, like if there's lots of different ways of doing it, it's not good. Like you need one solution that everybody in the industry uses. But then we also took it back, and we took it back into AKS and Arc as part of the product, because obviously our customers, they don't really want to be like pulling random open source projects off the internet and figuring out how to run them. They want us to take care of that for them, right? And so I think that we have a lot of this really nice blend between open cross-industry innovation, but then bringing it back home to a product so that an Azure customer can rely on it, can effectively call up my engineers 24/7 if they have a problem, or know that we're going to monitor it proactively and find problems even that they may not even notice, right? And so I think that that's a really important piece of how we do both open innovation in the Kubernetes ecosystem, but also meet our customers with what they need in order to be successful with these applications in their real world. The other thing that we've done with in that sort of same vein in open source and into the product is this idea of pod identity. So another really important part of compliance and other kinds of activities is least privilege, and also understanding what applications are doing what, right? And so if your individual containers or your individual layers in your application, like your front end or your middle tier or your back end, if they don't have independent identities, then it's very hard to say who's accessing the database, right? But if you can give your front end an identity, and you can give your middleware an identity and your back end an identity, you can actually set up access control so that, maybe the front end really shouldn't be able to access the database, but the middle tier should. So you can have, a managed identity in Active Directory associated with your front end, and it can have very limited permissions, maybe just to pull down a certificate. The middle tier, has its own identity, and it has access to the database. Maybe it doesn't have access to the certificate because it shouldn't be serving on the public internet anyway. So you can do that kind of fine-grained access control, and also in the audit logs see, that oh, this was the middle tier doing this. So if it gets compromised somehow, you can actually see, obviously, hopefully it doesn't happen, but like you can actually see the requests and audit trace and look for anomalies in the way that the middle tier is accessing. So pod identity is the way that we go and do that. It's, again, an open source project that was developed out on GitHub, but it's being integrated with AKS as a supported part of AKS, and it's being integrated with Arc as a supported part of Azure Arc. And so it's really awesome, I think, to see that blend of being able to do work out in the open with both the broader community, but also our community of customers, but then also bring it back to the product. Speaking of AKS, I think we've had a pretty amazing semester. AKS continues to be the fastest growing service in the history of Azure, which, a little bit of that's timing. I have to admit that AKS started at a point when cloud was maturing and growing really fast anyway. And so we gain a little bit of the tailwind of the overall, and not to mention COVID as well, and the sort of tailwinds of people really moving very quickly to cloud as they need to grow in response to the remote aspect of everything. But also it's a testament to the service itself that we've focused really a lot on the fundamentals and getting all the pieces to the right places so that the service can be used for those like life critical production things.
I've actually I've really been interested in some of the services that are running top of the Kubernetes service, like the Spring Azure service and a few others. Those are really great. Being able to have another service, perhaps by a third party provided, that can run on top of AKS seamlessly without actually knowing that AKS is running underneath it, is really a great feature as well. So.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of that both in terms of third parties, but also even in terms of our large scale large scale customers who have platform teams where they may not be running a platform built by someone else, but they build a platform for the rest of the company. So you have a team of 15 platform enterprise architect engineers who build up a higher level platform on top of AKS. And then the broad base of app developers in that company, well, they just have a Git repo and they push code into that Git repo or whatever the process happens to be. We're seeing a lot of that kind of like custom paths, if you will, that people are building specifically for their companies, which is pretty cool.
You mentioned security as well. That's really important. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago, you really couldn't tell when you went on Docker Hub if you were getting an official, real container of something that was provided by a legitimate provider versus something that was not. And that's really changed a lot recently. And of course, we have private container registries as well that you can use. But the security really is an important aspect of that as well. Being able to,
for sure. I sort of joke that like, it's not clear to me why, but somehow Docker made everyone forget that downloading random binaries off the internet was probably a bad idea. Right? Like just because there was a different interface that wasn't a web browser, suddenly everyone was like, sure, I'll download this random thing. And, and clearly I think we've matured a little bit since then. And frankly, we've done a lot of really great work with Azure Security Center as well. Because while it's definitely the case that malicious images are a problem, a lot of the problems that we've seen have actually come from misconfigurations, right? Have come from people leaving, web interfaces, putting a web interface up on the public internet that was never intended to be on the public internet. Right. And it's not a Kubernetes. It's not unique to Kubernetes. I mean, there's lots of stories of people putting development databases, MongoDB, up on the public internet and getting scraped. I mean, it's a common problem. And again, I think that's part of why things like policy are so important, because people should not be able to accidentally do things like that. Right. Like you can't trust that you're going to train people to do the right thing. You have to have automation that's going to catch it. Right, like people will always make mistakes. People will always forget. Even people who know how to know the right thing that they should be doing, they'll just make mistakes. And so you can't trust. You have to have the machinery to protect things. So
it could be the best of intentions, but they might let something get old and it has some vulnerabilities, and all of a sudden your systems are vulnerable. So
that's part of it too. I mean, I think that one of the things we also realized with AKS is that it's not like AKS isn't a thing in the vacuum, right? AKS is part of living with Security Center, living with GitHub, because like you need both the signal that says, hey, we looked at the images you're running and that image is old and there's a CVE. It was secure when you deployed it, or we thought it was secure when you deployed it, but a new CVE has been discovered. But then also the GitHub and GitHub Actions side of the house, where you need to be able to rev a new version, right? Like it's great to know that you have a problem, but if you can't roll out new software, it's hard to fix it, right? So I think that AKS is a piece of the puzzle, but the great thing about Azure and Microsoft generally is like we have all of the other pieces that are necessary to really operate your application securely and at scale. So
absolutely. Hey, you mentioned all the different components we have and all the moving parts for Azure. How are we making that easier for users these days? What have we added recently that is helping users visualize and deploy and manage things securely with policy, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different pieces to this, honestly. Absolutely, as we've sort of transitioned from the early adopters to the sort of late adopters and beyond, what we're seeing is people who they really want more opinions, right? Like in the early adopter phase, people just kind of want you to give them something, and then they're going to play around and they really want to try all the things, and they're really excited about getting deep and learning stuff. I think in the late adopter phase, people just have a job to do, right? They've been told like, hey, you need to launch this app and we're launching it on Kubernetes. And so they just they want to get from point A to point B as securely and reliably as possible. And so we're doing a lot more to provide streamlined experiences so that you don't have to make as many choices effectively, right? So like stuff like the GitHub Actions work that we did, so that if you want to set up a deployment to AKS, we can actually you can just use that GitHub action. You just, a little bit of YAML in your GitHub repo, and you're ready to go to deploy into that cluster. Surfacing a lot more kind of cluster health metrics and stuff like that of the AKS cluster, and making people more aware of what's going on as well, is another really important piece of that, so that they can understand, how their service is operating. But I also think that we have to provide some higher level experiences as well. And so, for example, there's CADA, the Kubernetes event-driven autoscaler that was developed out of the Azure Functions team, that can be used. And they just hit a 2.0 release, and that can be used to provide like functions as a service experience on top of Kubernetes, right? Because for many developers, asking them to figure out even how to build and push a container may be a bridge too far, right? And they really just want to take that little snippet of JavaScript and push it and have sort of the magic happen to make it run somewhere. And then while it's great to have that service as an Azure service in Azure Functions, there's a lot of environments where, like on-prem at the edge, where they don't have the Azure Functions running, or alternatively, like they may be doing function style programming, but someone else is doing more traditional container Kubernetes development, and those services need to interoperate together. And so having that ability to have different kinds of programming models in the cluster to enable different teams to collaborate together is a pretty big win. And I think that's an area where we're continuing to invest. We're going to continue to see innovation going forward. The Kubernetes itself, I just having this big discussion with the founder of Chef on Twitter the other day, about like the potential for things on top of Kubernetes, and whether like what that looks like. And I think it's, Kubernetes itself is mostly baked. You continue to make changes, but it's mostly baked. But the real area where there's a ton of open space and development and honestly experimentation that's needed is in that space of developer productivity on top. And how do we make it, simpler for people to do the right things easily, right? Like to fall into that pit of success instead of sort of stumbling around. And so, I think that's going to be an area that we continue to work on for a very long time. I think Kubernetes is sort of, to take a Microsoft analogy, like Kubernetes is sort of DOS right now, right? And we're sort of stumbling our way towards Windows 98. And that is sort of, that took 10 years. So like that maybe even a little more. So I think that's the sort of maybe the 10-year journey that we're now on, is how do we get there?
Nice. Yeah. What about, so when you mentioned, things running on top of Kubernetes, how do you sort of reconcile the intersection of open source community work and the product work that we're doing at Microsoft, and connecting the two together and cooperate?
Yeah. I talked about a little bit about that earlier, about how we think about we need to be doing open innovation, especially in areas where we need to be cross industry. But ultimately, people expect a product that's going to just work. If it has problems, they have somebody they can call and talk to. That is going to. So I think that what we think about when we think about open source and the product is, if it's something that needs to be cross industry, if it's something that's like what I would call undifferentiated heavy lifting, there's no real reason for it to stay in a closed environment. Those are all things that we're going to go open source, because we need to build community, or because it just makes sense to put it out there. And then there's other parts where, it just doesn't make sense. Like, it's very specific to running the Azure Kubernetes service, right? Like implementing the resource provider for the Azure Kubernetes service. No one else other than us is going to ever need to do that. So, that's a place where we keep things, more in-house. And I think that's the right balance in my mind. I think in a lot of cases with this open technology, the thing that people want to pay for isn't the intellectual property, it's the support and the operations. And so it doesn't matter that you take, the code and you make it open, because the product is effectively running it for people and enabling them to forget about the fact that they have it running and just let you handle upgrades. And so like with the Kubernetes service, we're on the embargo list so that if there's a vulnerability, we get notice of that ahead of time, so we can make sure that our customers are patched and secure on day zero, right? Yeah. And that's the kind of thing that people want to pay for, and frankly don't want to do themselves, right? And so I think that's great, because it means that we can do a lot of our innovation out in the open and yet still have something of value to sell as part of the product that we put forth. Cool. And I think especially in that broad market, that's really where people are, they're looking for you to just sort of take care of things for them, make their lives easier. Absolutely. Sort of a platform that you don't really need to think about, and then you can actually run, just focus on actually doing the job that you have to focus on. So absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Speaking of community, adding OSM and other projects that we have for the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, what was it like to work with the CNCF, and how did the whole process start? Yeah, so it's been great. Actually, I just had a CNCF technical oversight committee meeting this morning, where we were actually discussing some projects in their various stages. I was actually really pleased that the Helm project, which we're a major contributor to Helm, just reached graduated status in the CNCF. So graduated is like you've proven all the way through, like you can't go any further than being graduated. And it's a mark that like there's a large community and it's stable and production grade. And so CNCF has graduated, and then incubation, which is, we think you're on the right track. We think you're going to get to graduated eventually. And then Sandbox, Sandbox is actually in some ways the most interesting, because there's a lot of people out there who want to be in CNCF, to open the doors to collaboration, so that multiple companies who might be competitors can actually come and collaborate on source code without worrying about enabling their competitor. And so we've always struggled with like, how do we put a bar there so that like we don't just take absolutely everything, but how do we also make it really wide open and enable innovation and not cut things off too early. And there's only a small number of us on the technical oversight committee, and so with Sandbox, we've actually basically put a pretty formal list of like, if you do these things, we'll put you in Sandbox, right? If you have a code of conduct, if you have more than one company, if you're out on checklist style, so that we can run through and just like go through quickly. And I think that if people are thinking, hey, I have this idea, we're working on it, does it make sense to put it into the CNCF? I think that one of the things we really are looking for in that Sandbox process is, do you have collaboration, right? Like if it's just you, it's just your project, it's probably not ready yet, because we're looking for, the CNCF is set up to facilitate collaboration. And so, but if you're in a place where, 3 or 4 companies are coming together, but it's in somebody's personal repo, and people are starting to say, yeah, but where's the copyright going? What is the license? What's the licensing like? What about trademark? Like, those are all really good reasons to start, putting things into the CNCF sandbox. As well as I think some of the basics of like good project health, like a code of conduct, right? Things that are just essential these days for ensuring that we build healthy communities. And Sandbox itself now is very sort of automated and lightweight. So you basically fill out a form, it goes into a spreadsheet. Once a quarter, we go through and review all of them in the spreadsheet. And probably 85% of the projects that go through that process get pushed into Sandbox. And then from there, it's a little more complicated to get to incubated. You got to really show some user interest and show some cross-company collaboration. And obviously, graduated is an even higher bar, and that's why I think it's so great that Helm made it this recently. But yeah, it's a great place, and it's fun to hang out with a bunch of other people from around the industry, right? Even in these remote times, and we were all on video before, so actually COVID hasn't really affected that feel any. So it's all virtual travel. Yeah, right. No, well, I mean, it was always virtual anyway. I mean, it's funny. There's people from Europe, there's people from Asia on that call. Time zones make it a little hard to find the right slot, but we work on it. Sure, absolutely. When you say
you know, you were talking a little bit about licensing and code of conducts and things like that. Are those provided by the CNCF, or are those each project have their own that they decide to use, and how does that actually work?
Yeah, so the CNCF exists as part of the Linux Foundation, and so some of this stuff comes from the Linux Foundation. Some of the stuff like the code of conduct is CNCF specific and is required. There is one code of conduct. You can't just have any code of conduct. You have to have, there is a single code of conduct, because that consistency is really important.
Yeah.
You know, for licensing, people tend to use Apache 2, although it is possible to have other licenses as long as they're open source licenses.
Sure.
And then for governance is probably the place where the CNCF is the loosest. We have some ideas about, like, you know, we want to make sure that projects aren't dominated by a single vendor, and that there's the right kind of opportunities for people to, like the way that you move through becoming a maintainer or whatever is really well documented, so people understand how it works. But CNCF itself doesn't sort of make any rules about how a project is governed, as opposed to there are other foundations that take different approaches and maybe really, you know, specify all the roles and all this sort of thing. But CNCF sort of tries to be pretty lightweight in terms of describing how a project is run, and really only, I think, dictates in places where we really believed it was important, like code of conduct.
Sweet. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's our time today. Really, thank you very much, Brendan, for your time. And I do want to share a couple of links, if I could, on my screen.
Absolutely.
Before we get going here. Let me see. Right here. There's a couple of things I wanted to tell the viewers about. If there we go. So there is a Learn module. So Microsoft Learn is where you can learn these self-guided tutorials. I'm going to share some links in a second, but this is a really cool Learn module. It takes you all through what is Kubernetes, how it works, when to use Kubernetes, for those of you who are new to it. There's this other thing that, that is called the Kubernetes Learning Path, which is very cool. It's this downloadable thing that takes you from 50 days from zero to hero with Kubernetes. And by the way, they're produced by Microsoft, but it's mostly generic Kubernetes topics. So you could run this. Once you learn about this, you could actually run it on any platform, although Azure is our preferred one. And one of the cool things I saw here, for those of you who might not have seen this, a lot of people have, but the Kubernetes story, Fippy Goes to the Zoo. Have you seen this? This is pretty cool. It's a kid's story, and it talks about how Kubernetes works, and it basically educates you and your children, if you want, on how Kubernetes actually happens. So I'll post those in the chart right now. Do you have anything to add to that? Or?
Oh, I was going to say, and just credit to Karen Chu and Matt Butcher, who are both on the Azure team, and we're deeply involved, and actually did at KubeCon last year, I think it was, did a sort of fireside story reading of this book, so which was pretty cool. You can probably find it on YouTube if you go looking for it. Matt had his like cardigan sweater on and everything. It was perfect. And I also wanted to say, like, the 50 days from zero to hero, it doesn't have to take 50 days. If you want to move through that one a little faster, you can go through that one a little faster. So don't be daunted by the fact that it says 50 days. It's like 50 days in very bite-sized chunks. So and it was great. It was great chatting with everybody. And as always, you can hit me up on Twitter, and happy to chat more about everything Azure, Kubernetes, and open source.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. That was wonderful. And I just want to take us to the next spot. I posted the items in chat, so thank you, Brendan.